This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show begins with a conversation on breeding soundness exams, otherwise known as BSEs, with K-State beef reproductive specialist Sandy Johnson. Sandy provides great insight on why these underutilized tests can help producers mitigate some of the risks involved with breeding season. We're also joined today by Kelsey Anderson Onofre. She serves as our K-State Extension wheat pathologist, and today she shares information on choosing a fungicide to combat the many fungal diseases that affect Kansas, as well as some advice on whether or not early fungicide applications will benefit producers this year. In today's milk lines, fluctuating temperatures in the spring and fall often create respiratory issues for calves. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show by covering some of the issues dairy producers may see and what they can do to reduce respiratory issues on the farm. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State beef reproductive specialist Sandy Johnson for a conversation on breeding soundness exams. Sandy, thanks for joining us. Now's the time really to be thinking about these things.
Right. We've got a lot of bull sales going on and people are thinking about purchasing bulls, but most people have an existing bull battery they're using, and our statistics would say that at least 10% of those bulls will fail on an annual basis, and so we need to be thinking about testing those bulls prior to turnout.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to be stuck with that 10% if that's your one bull that you're working with for a season. So that really emphasizes the importance of BSEs and why they're still regularly conducted year to year to this day, right?
Right. And the other thing we see in our national surveys is that probably they're underutilized. More people need to not just assume if he's got one of this and two of that everything is fine and you'll have pregnant cows at the end of the season, because that may not be the case. And, really a bull breeding soundness exam is a risk management tool. And the price things these days, it's just hard to fathom that you would not want to use as many risk management tools as you could.
These breeding soundness exams, if listeners are tuning in and they're not familiar, which I doubt our listenership isn't familiar with these tools, let's kind of go over this comprehensive exam and what all it typically really includes.
Right. A breeding soundness exam should include a physical evaluation. We're looking at feet and legs, obviously if he's crippled, but, eyesight is important. And then we're going to measure the scrotal circumference. Size of the factory is important. You want to palpate the internal organs, the internal reproductive tract, to make sure everything is normal there, not an infection. You need to be able to fully extend and visualize the penis to make sure, again, everything is normal. And then we want to collect a semen sample. And, often we just think of a semen test, and that's a very important part of it, but it should include all of those portions to really prevent any problems from missing something that's wrong. So look for those components in a breeding soundness exam.
Absolutely. I think the motility aspect of that, semen evaluation, it was so interesting to me as an undergraduate when I first learned about breeding soundness exams. Having a veterinarian show you on a screen kind of what she was seeing through her microscope. I think that's something that producers sometimes forget the importance of.
Right. And motility can be challenging in some of our environments to keep the cells warm enough that we don't lose motility. But yeah, motility is very important, as well as the proportion of normal cells. Our standards for passing a breeding soundness exam are not as high, I believe, as the Canadians, and theirs would have 80% normal cells, where ours is 70%. But there's data that shows difference in, I think, like a 6% improvement in pregnancy of those bulls that were classified having greater than 80% normal cells versus something less than that. So while we often turn out bulls and don't think about their contribution, but there are differences in bulls and they do go bad. So we do need to test them and see what that semen quality looks like, as well as all those other components.
You mentioned environmental factors being a component there. That wasn't a problem for where I'm from. It wasn't really something we considered because our temperatures didn't get as low as they do here in Kansas. But here in Kansas, that's a really real issue.
Right. Some people may recall we had a pretty cold snap prior to Christmas, and it seems like there was another one, was that in February? I forget when it was, but we've had some pretty good cold snaps. And, normally the bull is able to regulate the height of that scrotum to regulate temperature. But in extreme conditions, when there's no protection from the wind, and if it's a combination of wind and snow and wet, we can certainly see some frostbite damage on the scrotal. And depending on, the severity, there may be a short-term hit to fertility, or it could be permanent in extreme cases. So, you can see some scabbing sometimes when that occurs. And, given that we've had those types of events, and I have no idea where everybody had their bulls during those events, but weather can have bad impacts. So it's just another reason to make sure that we're not taking a chance turning out a bull that really can't make any cows pregnant.
Of course, a veterinarian having them play a role in these breeding soundness exams is always an important aspect of it. And because of that, you always want to be sure that you're communicating with your veterinarian the timeline of things and things like that, right?
Right. The breeding soundness exam gives us an evaluation of the fertility at what moment in time. So we want to do that as close to the breeding season as we can, but yet we need to if we find that we have a problem and we didn't know it, we need to be able to find a replacement. So we got to give ourselves a little time in there. So those are all considerations in timing. And, another thing, many of the veterinarians will have a day or multiple days where they're testing bulls in the clinic. It's a great opportunity for producers with smaller number of bulls because the clinician can be set up with their equipment to do that semen evaluation. And, it works for everyone to take advantage of that situation. So it would encourage you to look for those opportunities. And I get it. Nobody really wants to handle bulls, but, it's risk management. We need to make sure we're turning bulls out. And the other caveat with our bull breeding soundness exam, it does not test libido. We have some tests. They're not real repeatable. Bulls learn over time. So how we tested a yearling bull may not have a lot of meaning later on. So what that means is we do a breeding soundness exam, turn out good bulls, but we still need to watch those bulls once we've turned them out, particularly a yearling bull, to make sure he can really service a cow and everything is working as we expect. So it's not a gold shield that protects from everything, but it's our best tool to help make sure we turn out satisfactory potential breeders.
Good reminder that it's not a surefire thing. But as we think about, you mentioned the difficulty of sometimes handling bulls and getting them, when we're traveling with them, if we're taking them to the veterinarian or even just running them through a chute system in general, because of the nature of handling them, it's not always a fun experience. So now is also a good time to make sure you're getting those vaccinations in, right?
Right. And we want to handle them as few times as possible, but we don't want to forget them as part of our health program. And so make sure that as you're planning with your veterinarian for that examination, to also make sure you're getting the vaccinations that fit your herd health program, because they can shed BVD virus and, in a sense, prevent cows from getting pregnant from that virus. So we want to avoid that at all costs.
Absolutely. Yeah. A holistic approach to health in general when we're thinking about these breeding soundness exams and going through the process of doing them. So, Sandy, when you think about preparing for breeding soundness exams, is there anything producers should also be keeping in mind, leading up to the process?
Well, the condition of the bull, we have data, a thin bull doesn't have the volume and quality of semen as a bull in better body condition. So we want to be thinking as we're approaching the breeding season, we want to make sure those bulls are at least a body condition score 5 when we turn them out. And so as we're, coming however many days you have until your breeding season starts, you want to think about what that bull's condition is. Do we need some extra groceries? Sometimes, there's problems with sharing in the bullpen, and you might need to sort an individual off in order to get that body condition up. But the other thing to think about in managing those bulls is we certainly would like to have the bulls that are going to go to the same pasture, they need to determine their pecking order before they get to that pasture. So you may need to catch Junior up a little bit with some extra feed, but if he's going out with big bull number 2, whatever, they need to get together and sort things out before they get to the cows at the start of the breeding season.
Absolutely. A great reminder there of some of those behavioral issues that can come up, and you don't want to be surprised in that instance when you're throwing them into your herd. You want to kind of know what you're going to be dealing with to begin with.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, Sandy, these have been great tips today. Thank you so much for all of this information. And if listeners are tuning in and they're looking for maybe some more tips on breeding soundness exams, or maybe, information on what to expect if they are going to have breeding soundness exams done this year, where can they find information like that at?
Well, a couple places. Our beefrepro.org website has a number of recorded presentations from really some of the top bull people in the country. That would be my number one source. There's proceedings papers, as well as you can listen to the whole video. We have some more limited information that you can find from ksubeef.org. And if you have trouble finding any of it, please contact me, and you can find me at either of those websites.
Absolutely. Well, I'll list some of those resources in today's show notes, which, as always, can be found on agtoday.net. But as always, Sandy, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Beef Reproductive Specialist Sandy Johnson joining us for a conversation on breeding soundness exams this year. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we'll be back with our K-State Extension Wheat pathologist, Kelsey Anderson Onofre. Today, she's joining us to share some information on choosing a fungicide to combat the many fungal diseases that affect Kansas wheat. She also shares some advice on whether or not early fungicide applications will benefit producers this year. Right after that, we'll end today's show with this week's Milk Lines, where K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk has spring cleaning reminders to help with fly season this year, which is just around the corner. We'll be back with that and more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by one of our friends here at K-State. She is Kelsey Anderson Onofre. She serves as our K-State Extension plant pathologist, and she's joining us today to talk through some wheat disease strategies for 2023. So, Kelsey, before we get into things, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's always great to be here.
Absolutely. So we're approaching your busy time of year here soon. Wheat is slowly but surely starting to spring up a little bit as things get warmer and nicer outside.
Yeah, that's right. And my phone has started to ring, so that's when I know it's really starting to be that time of year here again.
And with that comes, I guess, some of these concerns with preparing for mitigating diseases this year. So when it comes to some of the diseases that we think about with wheat here in Kansas, what are some of the main ones of concern?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sometimes it really depends on the weather and the year and the part of the state we're in, right? So if we're out west, we're thinking about viral diseases and we're thinking about rust, right? And if we're in the east, we're also thinking about our rusts, but we also might be thinking more about some of our leaf spotting diseases like tan spot, Septoria leaf blotch, Staganospora nodorum blotch. These are the big ones that survive in residue, right? So those last few, the rusts, our leaf rust and our stripe rust and our leaf spotting diseases, those are our fungal diseases, right? So those are the ones we're really targeting when we're thinking about fungicide applications, which I know is what we're talking about today.
Yeah, that's really going to be the focus of our conversation. And with so many, fungal diseases that we have to worry about, I think some people kind of get overwhelmed with the amount of fungicides that are out there. So when it comes to kind of selecting the best fungicide for a producer, what really goes into that?
So that's a great question. And so at K-State, we actually publish annually a fungicide efficacy rating guide. And this guide is really nice because it's not only incorporating K-State data that tell us how different fungicides that are widely available on the market respond to the different diseases that we're most likely to see here in Kansas, but it also pulls in data from our colleagues around the country, right? So it's actually a pretty robust data set that goes into rating these different fungicides. So if you open that document, you'll see that we have a lot of the very common fungicides listed there. And usually if we have a couple years of data, we'll add a new product. So for example, this year we added the product from Bayer, Prosaro Pro. That's a replacement product or a product that's a second generation maybe of a product called Prosaro. So it adds an SDHI, a different type of fungicide. And so we do have several years of data on that product now. So we were able to add that to the table along with the fungicides that we already have there. And it's nice because it tells us for some of our major diseases like stripe rust or leaf rust, if that product is excellent or very good in our trials, and, if it's potentially not labeled, right? So sometimes different fungicides that are common for one disease might not be labeled for other diseases. So we try to put some of that information there as well. And we also give some other information about just the rates that are recommended for use for wheat diseases, and also any harvest restrictions. So, for example, if there's a pre-harvest interval, which all of these fungicides have, right? When's that last moment in the season we can make an application, right? So we try to summarize that down, make it as simple as possible there in that K-State Wheat Fungicide Efficacy Guide.
Great resource for sure. And like you said, updated yearly, which makes it super timely and up to date with, like you said, current application timeframes and new fungicides that can be used. So that's a great resource for producers to check out if they're looking to make their own decisions this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always say, we try to put as much information there as possible, but it doesn't replace reading the label and making sure that we're keeping up to date. Sometimes labels change mid-year or something like that. So, it's always good to read the label and make sure we're in compliance with what's written there when we're choosing our fungicides.
Absolutely. And when it comes to making fungicide decisions, I know that there's a lot of other resources out there, such as like knowing what variety. I know that's a good, important thing for producers to do. And I know there's a resource available through K-State on that as well, right? Varieties and how different diseases affect them.
Yeah, so that's another one we work really hard on during the summer. That's the Kansas Wheat Variety Guide. But it's always good to revisit it this time of year as we're carving out our plan for our fungicide applications, because some of our varieties, they might be very good for stripe rust, for example, but more susceptible to our leaf spotting diseases. Or they might be very good for leaf rust, but susceptible to stripe rust, right? And that might help us pin down when we would be able to make that application and have that application be the most efficient.
Talking about the timing of applications, I know we're approaching that time of year where producers are starting to get antsy, I feel like, and they're like, I'm ready to get out in the field. And with that comes the idea of early applications for some. So when it comes to early applications and fungicides, what are some of the things that producers should really know about that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we do get that question a lot, especially this time of year. So sometimes, it just is economical, or, it starts to make sense to think about that application timing that's somewhere between what we call green up and that jointing time frame. And usually that will go in with a fertilizer application or even with that herbicide application. So we might put that in the tank at the same time. And, some studies have shown that there can be small yield benefits of that early fungicide application. It doesn't happen in all years and in all environments, but we can see in some situations an impact from that early fungicide application. So, that's the positive of making that application. It can be inexpensive because we don't have to make an independent application, right? We're going on the field with our sprayer anyway, with our rig anyway, and so we can just include our fungicide with that application. And there are early season diseases, we could see that suppress those early season diseases, right? So if you have something like a tan spot and you get that early application on around jointing, you could see your lower leaves protected, and that might protect your flag leaf as it starts to move up the canopy, right? So you protect the low leaves, you don't get that sporulation on your lower canopy, you provide some benefit that way. The important thing, though, that we do caution is that that early fungicide application doesn't replace a flag leaf application when it's indicated. So that flag leaf and that leaf below the flag leaf are really the leaves, those kind of final leaves that drive a lot of our yield in wheat. So those leaves are not protected from that early fungicide application, right? Most of our fungicides, they don't have that type of action where they would really be able to move to new growth. So that's just an important caveat, that if we do make that early application, we still need to be scouting and thinking about our flag leaf application, that timing that's somewhere between what we call Feeks 8, when our flag leaf starts to emerge, through essentially heading and flowering, right? A fungicide timing somewhere in there can really be what drives our yield. So it's important to just remember that there might be some small benefit from that early application, but really that late application is what's protecting our yield. And I would caution not to forget that late application. One other thing to think about when we're thinking about that early application is really making sure that we are planning our fungicide program. because a lot of these fungicides have use restrictions that say you can only apply, say, a certain amount of the active ingredient in the season. So if we say want to apply, tebuconazole early in the season, we would maybe lose our ability to apply that same product later in the season. So it's really important to, if you're applying early, just to be mindful of those use restrictions and plan accordingly.
That brought to mind a question of interactions between some of these fungicides. So if you applied something, let's say early season, and you weren't able to apply it again, later in the season when you really needed it, is there the option of finding out which ones kind of interact and play well together that you could apply later on? Is that a concern?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're not as worried about there being a negative impact of applying, a certain class of fungicides. Most of our fungicides, they do play well together. The biggest risk would just be making sure we're staying within those label restrictions. In wheat, often you're only allowed to make a single pass of an active ingredient at the labeled rate. So, that's something to caution. There are some products out there with special labels, something like Top Guard, for example, and just putting that out there as an example, has a special label in Kansas and other states where they can make dual applications at a split rate. So there are a few products like that where, your full rate is, I believe, 10 fluid ounces per acre application, but they do have a special label rate for that product where you can make one 5-ounce application early, followed by another 5-ounce application later. So there are some examples of products that do allow a split application, but not all products have that type of special label. So it's really important to kind of plan out both applications accordingly.
Sure. Another example of why it's important to know your label and be very familiar with it before using a product. So great example there. And, you mentioned while you were talking about early applications that it's not a replacement for something. It's just something that's an added benefit in some situations and in certain environments. Is this year kind of the situation we've seen? I know there's a lot of diversity across the state. Is this year a good case for an early application?
Well, here's the fields that would probably be kind of my top targets for that type of application. And those would be fields where we're wheat on wheat, right? So the fields where you are in those wheat on wheat fields, you have that disease that survives in the residue, right? It's like our tan spots and our septorias that kind of survive in that wheat residue and then move up to the lower canopy and start to build, and you can have loss of your lower canopy and then move up into your flag leaves. So those fields that are wheat on wheat, and especially that have, moisture coming down in these next few weeks into April that can start that disease, those would probably be our targets for getting that, highest chance of payoff. Now, it will depend a bit on how the weather looks here over the next few weeks in parts of the state to really see if that will make a difference.
Excellent. Well, good to know. I know that this was a beneficial segment. I've learned a lot, so I'm sure producers have as well. So I can't thank you enough, Kelsey, for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was our K-State Extension plant pathologist, Kelsey Anderson Onofre, joining us for a discussion on fungicide applications and some diseases to look out for this year. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. Today, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk covers some of the issues that dairy producers may see in their calves this spring when it comes to respiratory disease, often related, he says, to fluctuating temperatures.
As we enter into the spring months and we start to get away from winter, we experience a lot of up and down in temperatures, and sometimes those things are not super on the health of our calves that we have on our dairy. So what are some things that you need to look out for as you think about how you might reduce the chances of your calves getting respiratory disease during these up and down times, but also during the whole year? As we look at calf health, it's really something that we can have issues with throughout the year. Maybe more issues as we look at spring and fall when it comes to respiratory disease in our calves. So first off, as we think about respiratory disease, or sometimes we call it BRD, there are some things that predispose your animals to this. The number one issue is poor colostral immunity. Now, this is generally due to impaired passive transfer of immunoglobulins. Generally, the first thing we see is scours, and usually followed by that, 7 to 10 days later, we may see some issues with respiratory disease. There are some other things that sometimes crop up along with that. Those things might be things such as bovine viral diarrhea, BVD, And we also see bovine respiratory syncytial virus, BRSV, at this time as well. So when you look at all of these, they're around our farm. They're going to be probably endemic to our farmstead. So why do we see breaks with those? Well, generally it has to do with the fact that we have a calf that has an impaired immune system, might be due to issues with colostral transfer, could also be just overall stress level. In other words, if they break with a case of diarrhea, what's your nutrition program like? Do they have any reserve to run on, or do they go backwards during the time that they are suffering from this case of diarrhea? Now we have a situation where, yes, their immune system is impaired, and yes, they are susceptible to these types of diseases. So, what are some things that you can do on your farm? Well, number one, make sure you have the proper colostrum management. Are they getting enough? Is it of high quality? And are we reducing the chances that they will get bacterial contamination when fed the colostrum? Again, a lot of times this relates back to how we're handling colostrum on our farm. So, what's the gold standard to try to determine whether or not you got effective passive transfer? Well, probably the best way to check that is to look at total blood protein when the animals are about 2 to 7 days of age. If we're not getting effective passive transfer then, set up an appointment with your nutritionist and your veterinarian, have them there on the farm at the same time. Let's review the colostrum program on your farm as well as the feeding program that you have for that. Second main thing that I see is just your feeding program. You know, we've got a lot of great data out there that shows that a higher level of liquid nutrition during the feeding period is very, very important. So what am I talking about? Yes, the accelerated growth program. If you're only feeding 2 quarts of liquid feed twice a day to your calves, it's not really an adequate nutrition program. It doesn't really foster high levels of growth. If you would simply switch to a feeding program that includes more liquid feed, yes, I realize it costs more money, but you get great improvements in the health of the calves when you do that. So it's really worth the investment. And you know, you don't have to have a robotic feeder to feed those calves. You can simply gradually work animals up on the amount of liquid feed that they receive every day. You can use color-coded bottles. You can use different tags on the calf hutches to determine whether or not those animals get 2 quarts each feeding or 3 quarts or maybe even 4 quarts each feeding. Very simple for those that are feeding the calves to follow, and a great way for you to increase the health of your calves without investing a lot of money in equipment. One final note, if you have calves inside and in buildings, pneumonia a lot of times is associated with just poor air quality. So improving the air quality that we have in those barns is vitally important in addition to the other 2 things that I mentioned earlier. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.